What's up, guys? Once again on the channel, this time for a real thing. It's a fantasy variation against Caro Kann. To be honest, there were like a couple of good requests about this line. For a long time, I've been planning to make it. They're just forcing me, please give us some interesting against Caro Kann, and I just have to tell you that this is going to be a real thing with lots of novelties, with new games. But mainly some of my homemade analysis that are really working well into the practice. I checked most of these games just as usual with an engine. I'm gonna give you, more importantly, ideas what to do and where and how to play. But I just have to tell you, this is gonna be a real test for Caro Kann players after you learn stuff from this lesson. So enjoy and let's go. Fantasy variation against Caro Kann. How does it appear? So after like e4, c6, d4, d5, f3, we have a fantasy variation. And what is it all about? You just don't want to go with and commit yourself with e5, don't want to play any knight c3, and not to do any things like that. So you just want to play f3 to defend the center, and in a way to provoke your opponent to go with d takes c4, in which case f takes c4 would bring you, first of all, strong center. That's one thing. And second thing, apart from having a strong center, you would also have like both of your bishops open. That is not the case in most of Caro Kann games. And just because of that, black players have to know their stuff in the fantasy line. It's not a case. From my experience and from what I could have seen in these, like while I was preparing for this lecture, they didn't know how to answer. So after like f3, there are like 5 typical answers. I'd begin with probably the most aggressive one by black, and certainly one of those let's just call it crazy options. Firuzia played it with black pieces. There were like a couple of other top GMs. Although e5 is not as dangerous as it looks at first glance. And it should be kind of confusing for white players if you're unfamiliar. But since you're going to check this lecture and since you're going to learn what to do, of course, it's not going to be a problem for you. So you take on e5 and they just go with the bishop c5. Any d takes e4, you just take, develop your knight and enjoy a very pleasant type of the game with king being in the center. They even have problems on the dark squares, mainly d6. So when they go with bishop c5, you just go knight c3. It's very important to do just knight c3 and to do this move. It's very important to do knight c3 because it's aimed against the main idea, and the main idea by black players is the battery. Why am I talking about the battery as the main idea? Because when they play queen b6 and somehow they would like to take advantage of our weak dark squares and the knight on g1, and mainly they just think and they're obsessed with the f2 weakness, we go with the knight a4. And here they have 2 options. They got an option to give you queen f2 followed by king e2 and queen d4. Queen a6 is just bad. You take the bishop, and with the bishop pair you're up 2 pawns at a moment actually, and have the bishop pair, so they cannot benefit from the king being on f2. If queen d4, you just take. And here I've been thinking, should you be playing like e takes d5, which happened in so many games, or playing something else? In my opinion, way better is f4. f4 keeps the strong pawn center. That's one thing, and that's like very important thing. But apart from that, when you give up the pawn on e4, you just play bishop e3, and it's this dark square bishop on d4 is kind of locked. So basically they gotta take, in which case you just bring your king closer to the center, and you shouldn't forget queens are off, so I don't mind. And also the dark square bishops are off, so nothing can harm the king in the center on e3. And when they play f5, I found a couple of games, but here I have an improvement for you. Bring the rook all the way to d1, and afterwards when they play knight e7 threatening check, play c4. Beautiful position. Sorry. You would like to go with rook d6, jump with your knight on c5, go with bishop e2 and maybe break the center with g4, play knight h3 or knight e2 depending on circumstances in the game. White has an amazing middle game, and black can hardly breathe here. That's all about e5 variation. Apart from e5, another line is queen b6. Queen b6 is always an interesting Caro Kann possibility. Queen b6 puts some pressure on both. Pawn on d4 in the center, pawn on b2. Although, if you want to play these variations really successfully, you shouldn't care much about material, and that's why they call it fantasy, because you can just develop like so many fantasies about while you play these games, creating lots of tactics, coming up with lots of initiative, attacking chess, and I really find it inspiring, I'd say. So you play knight c3, developing your right, and they have two options: to go e6 and to go d takes e4. Less common is e6, but looks like less, more solid. e6, solidifying and defending the center, although closing the light square bishop, but at the same time opening the bishop on b4 and preparing for both knight f6 and knight e7. Learn something. Against the fantasy variation, usually better and more common is knight e7. It's actually more solid for black players. After e6, I've been checking lots of things here, but in my opinion, a3 is just the best. It's just the best because you just prevent bishop b4. So now they have knight f6 and knight e7. If knight e7, it's time for bishop e3. That's one of the reasons for a3. So when you play a3, you don't only stop bishop b4, but you also allow yourself to develop the dark square bishop. Probably you're wondering, what the hell am I talking about? Because if queen b2, knight a4, and the queen is gone. So they just have to go learn this trick. It's a very common in all kinds of positions. So knight g and f6, bishop e2. Another surprising move with a big exclamation mark. You still cannot do queen b2, and if you take, bishop e7, knight f3, that's how, and that's why I go with the bishop e2. So I'm waiting for you to take, in which case you're just going to free up the f3 square for my knight. So after d takes, f takes, bishop e7, knight f3, I know a game where the guy played castles, queen d2, captured on b2, and played castle. Do we have everything here? We threatened to win the queen, so they gotta move the queen. We play e5, kicking the knight away, taking there to gain a tempo and to have both of these bishops targeting the king's side and going onto the king. What is so much better, and white managed to win this game relatively easy afterwards. This is what I like about the fantasy variation. Unusual type of structures for Caro Kann guys, and usually we end up having some sort of attack, which is a good thing, right? Usually we don't have it in boring Caro Kann, and that's why I like it so much. Apart from this, they can go with a3 and knight f6 instead of knight e7. Nothing. You play e5 and you play f4. When they play c5, knight f3, knight c6, you have two options: to go and to transpose into the French Steinitz variation with bishop e3. So it's going to be this one. So it's what Nakamura likes to play, queen b6, and usually they go queen d2. But instead of queen d2, second most common move for white is a3. And by the way, they can never take because you always have knight a4. But this line is completely, theoretical, and you just have to know really a lot. So in my opinion, it's way better to be very consistent, and after knight c6 to take on c5. So when they take, to go knight a4. I always like this knight c3, going with the knight a4, going after the battery. After queen a5, c3, b4, bishop to d3, and here after castle, for example, I very much like position like this where we really have nice attacking chances and plans on the king's side. Well, in the case of f6, I played a game, castles, e takes, and just c4. So what are you doing? First of all, they're having typical French structure, typical French light square bishop. They have problems with the outpost, and with c4, I'm showing a tendency here to exchange one of these pawns and to leave my opponent with clearly isolated and weak pawn on e6 or d5. And after bishop d7, queen e2, this just looks great, and white has a full initiative. So all things considered, when you look at this variation with queen b6, knight c3, instead of e6, which is very solid and where you play that move a3, d takes e4 is a little bit, I'd say, more leading to wider options for both sides. And they just want to go with some e5 afterwards. But here we won't give them that possibility and that pleasure. So we go with the bishop c4. Once again, I came up with a very interesting move. I just want to develop myself. Sorry, of course, it wouldn't be good for you to take on f3 and to help me developing my pieces. By the way, don't forget, you can't even play this because of bishop f7 and knight e5, and you're just having problems with king on f7 and bishop g4. In the case of knight f6, you just go castles. And if you play e6, I mean, you have a terrible light square bishop. For example, remember the following position, because you have it in Caro Kann, you have it in French, you have it in some different types of structures when the light square bishop is just locked. And how should you organize the attack? Just go with queen e1, queen g3, bishop h6, rook a to e1, and take a look at all my pieces. I enjoy my game. I have an attack, and initiative is on my side. So after bishop c4, taking on f3 is nonsense. e5 is something, for example, that if I was black would certainly occupy my attention. So you just go with it takes e5, and they have two options. To go bishop c5, which I expect to be done by most of these guys, and where I have a fantastic novelty. Or if they go with knight d7. Knight d7, they want to get the pawn back, but buddy, I won't give you the pawn back. I'm just going to include this e6, which I find of a great importance, because when you capture, I just take on e4, and for the rest of the game you just have to deal with position where my pieces are open, but you have lots of problems because your pawn structure is broken. In one game was queen b4, knight d2, knight b6, then you bring it back on the right place. In the case of knight c5, queen e2, f takes c4, making place for the knight, and here white at certain moment could just push this knight pawn on e5, go back with bishop on d3, go queen e4, launch the attack and crush this guy. Generally, you usually first of all, why do you need your queen on e2? To support the bishop on c4. Why else? When you do it, to support the bishop e3 here. And when they play queen b2, this is how I solve the problem of castles at a cost of a pawn, but I have a full initiative. Even if we count these like being a down a pawn, for what pawn? For isolated miserable pawn on e6. Who cares about that? So you just go with rook b1 and you have an amazing game afterwards. Make sure to put your king on h1, play some knight g5 and kill these guys. Finally, if they go with bishop c4, e5, d takes, and bishop c5, here I gotta show you a real novelty of mine. I really enjoy it, and it's queen e2. Who cares about the knight on g1? So look at this one. I already won a few blitz games with it. So when they play bishop g1, you just go knight e4. And who would say that being down a piece could be so productive and good and actually beneficial for you? First of all, you don't have an obvious way of getting the piece back. And believe it or not, no, that's not our intention. My intention is to go with the knight e6, to go after the weak f7, weak king on e8. You suffer because queen is pretty much tied up for the defense of the bishop on g1. g1 bishop is completely misplaced. You play bishop c5. I don't care, I play a4. I want to play a5. You play bishop e7 to get rid of a5 threats, because I was really threatening a5 to win the bishop on c5. a5. I go castles. And look at this. You're up a piece. For what? For one pawn. But what do I have in return? I have a safe king. You don't have a safe king. All your pieces are on the back rank, unlike my pieces. Strong knight that can all the time jump. Good bishop. Pawn on a5 that is fairly advanced. Rook that is going to come back into the game and go into the d1. And by the way, you have problems with this knight as well. You cannot develop it to e7 or f6. Only moment is knight h6, but I can always consider some knight f6 or bishop h6 ideas. Bishop e6, you take, rook d1 and queen c4. In position like this, I really have to say that I can't say it's winning for white, even though engine says it's winning. I would say it's much better, but practically it's hardly defendable for black players. And finally, if bishop c4, if they go with knight f6, you just go f takes c4. And I wouldn't be afraid of bishop g4. I would just tell my opponent, thank you so much for helping me to develop my pieces. Then if they take, I would take by bishop. I have a bishop pair. I kick this knight away, and I want to place, you know what, with an open f file, with a pressure on the f7, inability by black to make castle because of this weakness. I just want to go and show you a game where the guy played c4, played bishop h5, and this guy was completely lost. He was falling apart literally in this game. He played knight e3, captured, played rook f7, and after king h1 placed his king into safety, avoided this idea with e2 and discovered check, and black was just completely winning. What an easy way of winning and penetrating into their game. If e5, that's what I expect. Usually against fantasy variation, black players like to take on e4 and break with e5. You just take. They threaten mate. Watch out not to blunder this one. So you go queen e2. Usually this queen e2 doesn't only stop those mating patterns on f2, but also supports at some point bishop e3 and defends this bishop on c4. Knight e5, bishop e3, goes with knight f3, and here I was checking, should we go with h3 or play bishop d2? In my opinion, bishop d2 followed by long castles, king b1, for example, long castles, king b1, chasing away the bishop should give white a long-lasting advantage with much better game, because even when they play long castle, they will have lots of problems with a kind of exposed king on c8. And we've already seen like two variations. We've seen e5 and queen b6. What happens if g6? On g6, I want to show you Caruana's approach. He played knight c3, bishop g7, and played against Firuzia e5. I like e5. Makes so much sense. Reminds me on those versions of, like modern opening that goes with Caro Kann approach, and then you play e5 and close the bishop on g7. So it's kind of weak for black since the bishop is on g7. What's your weakness? Your weakness is currently pawn on e4, but on f3, but I'm going to push it on f4 anyways. So let's go. Also, inability to develop this knight. And for example, those who play, and there are lots of guys, knight h6. I insist on one move. Nobody understands the point of bishop f4. I won few blitz games, castles, and then you just play queen d2. Believe it or not, the knight is off. Because knight f5, this one, and the knight is just trapped. So they gotta go in this position with, instead of this line, with f6, in which case you take on f6, you play queen d2, you go h4, you go castles. And this reminds me of the French lesson where I taught you how to easily attack the French type of games. Okay, they have this pretty nice knight f7 and bishop g7, which means that we cannot benefit from having the better way bishop e3, queen d2. But what can we do? We can push h4, g4, launch the kingside attack, and our position looks really, really good. In the case of f6 makes so much sense because they want to undermine the center. That makes sense. f4, knight h6 makes sense. And if you play knight f3, he can go with bishop g4, swap it off, play knight f5, and so on. That's why you first play bishop e2. They go castles, knight f3, and when they play bishop g4, castles, knight f5, there is a special thing here. In order to keep the center strong, to keep the pawn chain, you gotta play knight e1. And the point of knight e1 is not only to avoid bishop f3, in which case knight, which was a good defender of the d4 pawn, won't be defending d4 pawn for a while, but also having, exchanging these bishops, but taking by knight. I insist, taking by knight. So now you have a good control of the d4 square, and anytime they go c5, c3, c takes, h5 not to kick it away with g4, knight f3, now we have ideal knights that control and fully support the center. Then knight c6 with the idea queen b6. I've been thinking about this position. White looks a little bit better, but I found a very nice plan with a4, rook a3, and rook b3, fighting the queen off on b6. Very nice one. And finally, let me show you Caruana's game that was a real masterpiece with the control on the dark squares, even though it was a blitz game. So this guy played c5. Firuzia was black. Caruana played f4, and that's a typical thing. They want to break the center, so you should be controlling this peak of the pawn chain on e5 and defending it by f4. They take, queen takes, threatening the pawn on d5. Firozia defended, knight f3, knight c6, and this was a killer move, bishop b5. Usually such structures are killed by bishop b5, bishop c6, and then take a look how he took full control of the dark squares. Played queen c5 threatening here, played bishop e3 controlling on the dark squares, played knight a4 controlling and having this queen, so in the case of bishop f8 he would just move the queen to c3, move the bishop because he needs the dark square bishop to control the dark squares, and plays the queen on c3 with full control of the dark squares. Take a look at this bishop, take a look at this one. Only good piece is knight, but we have two good knights, we had great bishop, and certainly what is so much better, and Caruana won the game. The game was played back to 2020 in Norway. I've showed you everything, and it's time to show you two main lines. And two main lines are either d takes e4, f takes e4 and e5, and e6. But let me just show you this Gambit variation that very much reminds me of King's Gambit. I don't find anything that special about Black's position when they try to, because Caro Kann players by default are kind of boring, positional, and a little bit, you know, like guys who are pretty much always afraid of our open games and attacks. So they shouldn't be a typical Caro Kann approach by Caro Kann players. But those who do it, they're so much afraid of our attacking possibilities. So let's go. We go knight f3. I found a couple of games. First of all, I want to show you a game of one of the best Serbian guys, Velimir Ivic, who played against champion of Lithuania, Pultinevicius, in Riga 2021. Velimir came up with a great novelty, knight bd2, and then he swapped off these bishops. I remember watching this game live, and I knew that because he's perfectly well theoretically prepared, and I knew that he prepared something here, but I was wondering why the hell he's exchanging these bishops and what is he trying to do. Then he played castles. He doesn't care about d3, just put the king on h1. Queen e7, played e5, and came up with the bishop g5. All of a sudden I started to realize that the black's position looks very shaky. Velimir came up with knight e6, captured, wants to play rook e1 and to win the queen. By the way, this bishop helps you in order not to make castles. Captured by knight on d4, threatening some rook e1, knight f5, and so on. And when this guy played f6, played bishop f4, knight f5. And look at this, he threatened on g7, came up with this check, captured there, and played knight c5. Pultinevicius, pretty good player, immediately resigned because he couldn't stop this one with rook here. He couldn't stop some other things, and basically this was also rook e1 in some moments to take on e5 and to win this in 20 moves to beat up 25-50 strength guy. It's really something. And apart from this bishop e6 idea, I've seen so many ideas with e takes d4 instead of bishop e6. E takes d4 is nothing. Then this reminds me on good versions of King's Gambit and Scotch Gambit. Even better, because now everything is open. I've seen so many things, but I'm just going to show you like 3 moves. On knight f6, you play castles and queen e1. Supports e5, goes on g3 in some moments, or when you play e5, queen goes on, supports e5 and d6, or queen goes on e4, or sometimes goes on g3 or h4. Bishop e7, you just go castles, knight g5, and the famous trick here is knight takes f7, rook f7, bishop f7, king f7, and d5. I found so many games won by white like this. In the case of bishop e6, you just take, play castles, and when they play, for example, bishop c5, knight g5, you're winning, threatening on e6 and f7. If they go knight f6, e5, knight e4, knight e1, fantastic move that threatens this check, that threatens queen f3, that threatens so many things, and that threatens even queen g4. Then knight d7, knight g5, you can defend both of these things. So after bishop e6, bishop e7 looks like the only move. You just take on d4, e6 is hanging, they're just falling apart. Believe it or not, after bishop c4, I just showed you that knight f6 doesn't work. Bishop e7 doesn't work because of castles knight g5. Bishop e6 is not enough. Bishop c5, Fedosov, top GM played. White played castles, knight f6, knight g5. And here you can make mistake, thinking like, aha, I can once again come up with the knight f7 and do the same trick. They won't take. They will play queen e7 and you'd be lost because this knight is locked. Because of that, you shouldn't play this. You have to play bishop f7. And that's the point. So if they play rook f7, you take. They cannot take because of e5, of course. But if they now play queen e7, you have this point with e5. And after knight e4, you play b4. Bishop b4, queen d3. And I found a game where the guy took on h6, took on e4, and won the game. Fantastic game by white. And it shows you that when they play it takes, bishop c4, only trick that you gotta be familiar with is castles, knight g5, and here you don't take knight f7, what happens in bishop e6 lines, but you actually go with something completely different. You go with bishop f7, and somebody might ask, but what if they don't take, but they play like this? Then just e5. I want to show you a game. d3, check, giving check to the king. King h1, knight g4, nothing, threatens nothing. So e6, and now queen d4. The guy was threatening smothered mate. Queen g1, rook g1, knight f2. All white has to know here is queen f3. He doesn't have knight f2. He doesn't have rook queen g1 any longer, and this is just completely lost. Finally, I gotta show you that when they play like this, and they don't take on d4, but play bishop g4, that's the main line. You play c3, and in my opinion, that's the best line. Caruana played it a couple of times, won all his games. Erigaisi played recently this year in Sweden against Salem. And after knight d7, bishop d3, hyper solid, castles. And here, of all the possibilities and moves, I'm suggesting bishop g5. Really good one. Knight bd2. So you just have ideal development. You just have like tension in the center. And when they play queen c7, threatening somehow e takes d4 and bishop h2, you shouldn't panic. You should be going with h3 and knight c4. You're going to threaten to chase this bishop away. And of course, to win on e5, they gotta play b5. And here, Kapnisis played bishop c2, threatening d takes e5, and won the game. Another nice grandmaster game from a couple years ago, where white, with the bishop pair and the strong center, dominated the black's game. And we just came to the last, but in my opinion, absolutely the best move for black. It's e6. I remember when I used to play Caro Kann, I only prepared e6 against Fantasy Variation because it's hyper solid. And now I chose knight c3 for you, bishop b4, and bishop d2. I chose for you to play like this because, in my opinion, bishop d2 always gives you a solution similar to the French whenever where you're forced to break the pawn structure. Here, not to do it, but to take by bishop and to keep the healthy pawn structure. That's one thing. Another thing is that if you go with the bishop d2, you're just willing to go with some bishop d3, and they'll show you one plan. So after knight e7, that's why I told you, I believe that knights, all together with bishop on e7 and stable pawn structure, knight on e7 is absolutely the most solid approach by black. So take a look at this one. a3, you always want to check whether they want to take or not. Usually they go back on a5. But I found a game where an IM captured on c3. GM from India, Bharat Koti, played bishop c3, of course. You keep the healthy pawn structure, and you got a bishop pair. And looks like, in the long run, white is going to be much better. But there is a plan by black where he instantly wants to play bishop a6 and to kill your bishop pair, this time the light square bishop. This guy played h4 because he's just willing to go with a typical whenever idea, but this time we don't have broken pawn structure. So don't mix it up with those positions. This is even better version. He captured an a6, and look how nicely he placed his pieces. I very much enjoyed in white's repositioning of pieces. Played queen d3, threatening the knight on a6. Played knight e2, developing the piece. Played h5, threatening h6. Played long castle, showing clearly what his intentions were. Bishop e1, solving the problem with the bishop and placing it on a better diagonal. Doing it on g3, putting the king into safety, and playing rook h to e1. After such a nice repositioning of white pieces, white was certainly the one who had a lot better game, and 10 games later he managed to win the game. I really much like it. And finally, in the case of a3, queen, bishop a5, you play bishop d3, knight d7, and you have one very nice move. It's f4. An idea of f4 is to support e5 ideas, but an idea of f4 is to also go with the knight f3. If they take on c3 and play d takes c4, yes, at the moment you have this stupid bishop, but don't forget and don't worry, you're just going to easily do something really nice with it. So you knight f3. They can't take on f4 because you can just play queen e2 and afterwards go with bishop d2, and you're happy to open up the game for your bishops. If bishop f6, knight f3, c5, knight b5, threatening check, and after this you just go with e5 and you just have a great game. So after h6, Grandmaster Johnny Hector had a great game, had a very nice attack with the bishop here, wants to eventually break with g4 and f5, and he drew the game, but he's technically winning in this position. And finally, after f4 c5 straight away, and that in my opinion looks absolutely the most promising, you just go e5, closing the center, and this time you have both of these bishops open while they can't take on c3, or they shouldn't do it because we can always recapture by bishop, and unlike whenever French positions, have a nice game. So after they go with c4, you go bishop e2, keeping place for the knight on f3, and placing the bishop on c1 to defend on d4. They have problems with this one, f6, g4, and they have problems. Initiative is on white side. They can sack, go with this, but I also have some ideas. I don't have to take on there, and I can play knight g5, and my position also look good. Probably this is one of the most promising options for them, but if you ask me, this is absolutely satisfying line with the white pieces against the Caro Kann. All things considered, hope that you enjoyed in this lecture. Hope that you're going to support this channel to come up with a little bit more donations than usual, because I start giving you like real lines with lots of novelties and some real analysis. But if you want to know even more about this variation, then you just have to ask me and to buy the PGN. All the best and see you next time.